Let's continue the Refuting Scofield series with a look at Scofield's footnotes for the Olivet Discourse, found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. I did a very eye-opening video on the Olivet Discourse where I harmonize all three passages and show how it literally reads. It showed us that Matthew and Mark are discussing the end times, while most of Luke is actually discussing the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Once we saw how to rightly divide those three chapters, we could then see what was truly relevant to the end times in those chapters. And then by understanding the Olivet Discourse in this rightly divided literal manner, we then saw how the Olivet Discourse clearly and literally teaches a post-trib rapture after the greatest tribulation, with the beginning of sorrows leading up to it. So let's look at his footnotes for these three chapters and see 100 years later where he was wrong and where he was still right. Matthew 24:3 is the beginning of the Olivet Discourse according to Scofield. I'll agree with him there. But then, here for verse 3, he decides to give us his full outline of what pretty much the entire chapter is going to say before you read it. He touches on several of the false doctrines already discovered in this series, such as the Israel is not the church error. He references Daniel 9:26 when he says, "The character of the age, wars, international conflicts, famines, pestilences, persecutions, and false Christs." Daniel 9:26 says, "And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined." Other than the word war, I don't see the connection Scofield was trying to make, but that's because he's just buttering us up for the rest of his outline. This footnote is just trying to add support for his biggest new false doctrine. False doctrine number 13. Daniel's 70th week is still unfulfilled. John Nelson Darby came up with this new doctrine, and Scofield ran with it. Nobody taught this new interpretation of Daniel 9:27 ever before Darby. The bottom line of his doctrine is that the end times will include a 7-year tribulation as a fulfillment of the final week of Daniel's 70th week prophecy. It is this particular doctrinal error that I believe is truly the root error of dispensationalism. Once you remove Daniel's 70th week from the end times equation, the entire dispensational argument falls apart. Please watch my Daniel 9 video and my Daniel's literal 70th week video. Then another new false doctrine shows up concerning the word abomination. Scofield takes the phrase abomination of desolation and links it to the phrase, "And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate." I'll bet you do too. This is the biggest new doctrine out there today still, but nobody taught this until Darby. There is a much better literal interpretation of the phrase in Daniel. Why is it plural? What does overspreading mean? Daniel was speaking of the continuation of the Jewish sacrificial system up until 70 AD destroyed it. Jesus was talking about what Daniel said in Daniel 12:11, not 9:27. False doctrine number 14. Daniel 9:27 is the abomination of desolation. Then another false doctrine comes when he's describing the Great Tribulation. It's linked to the Israel is not the church error. But he says the warning to believe Jews who will then be in Jerusalem. But the verse actually says, "Let them which be in Judea." It doesn't say Jews. False doctrine number 15. Jews are still a chosen bloodline. I find it a little funny that at the end of this footnote, Scofield says, careful study of Daniel 2, 7, and 9, and Revelation 13 will make the interpretation clear. Because he knew most people would find his new teachings to be very different than what was already understood by the church. He pleads for patience as he twists enough various chapters to make his new doctrine sound clear. And surprisingly, that's all he had to say for Matthew 24. But for Matthew 25:32, he says, "Those whom Christ here call my brethren." These brethren are the Jewish remnant, which is just another Israel is not the church error. This one twist interprets the word remnant. He says for Romans 11:5, during the church age, the remnant is composed of believing Jews. He has created the new false doctrine that the remnant must be part of the bloodline too. False doctrine number 16. Remnant only means the believing bloodline. In looking at Scofield's footnotes for Mark 13, many of them are parallel with Matthew 24, of course. But for Mark 13:8, Scofield links nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, etc., to the first 6 seals of Revelation 6. I find this very interesting, actually. Scofield hadn't corrupted this part yet. The next generations took care of that for him. But this goes to show that Scofield still had some of the apostles' doctrine in him. He wasn't teaching that the 7 seals are all opened after the rapture like many of today's dispensationalists do. And then looking at Luke 21, our third parallel passage of the Olivet Discourse, we again see Scofield get it right when he points out that Luke 21 is more about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, while Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are about the end times. It was the future generations of dispensationalists that started misinterpreting Luke 21, thinking it was about the end times too. So strangely, when we look at Scofield's footnotes regarding the Olivet Discourse, probably the most important scriptures regarding the end times, he didn't really have a lot to say. He had one foot planted firmly in his new dispensational theology, but he still had the other foot on solid ground. But even though he was still right about some of these things, he still did a lot of damage with these new false doctrines. False doctrine number 13, Daniel's 70th week is still unfulfilled. Number 14, Daniel 9:27 is the abomination of desolation. Number 15, Jews are still a chosen bloodline. And number 16, remnant only means the believing bloodline. All of them false doctrines.